Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to the first seminar for the Center of Literacy and Multilingualism for 2026. We are very happy to host Kimberley Campanello from Leeds, a professor of poetry from Leeds, and also Nicoletta Asciuto, a senior lecturer in modern literature from University of York. So this is a seminar hosted by the Literacy and Language theme of CELM, our center. The leads of this theme couldn't be here because of other commitments. So I am hosting and presenting the seminar as the director of CELM. This session will be recorded and made available on YouTube. I'm just letting you know. And with no further ado, I'll hand over to Kimberley and Nicoletta to talk about health, creativity, and the craft of translation. And I'm really looking forward to this talk.
Thanks, Christos.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christos. Well, for having us here today, virtually, and hi everyone online. I think Kimberley and I wanted to start with a couple of remarks together, and then we'll move to Kimberley giving her presentation, and then I will give my presentation. But Kimberley, do you want to say a couple of things about how today came about?
So essentially, I got in touch with Christos, which I'll talk in more detail about in my paper, and it has to do with the fact that I have young onset Parkinson's disease, and I have been working across languages, English and Italian, and I was noting certain things. So let's just say that quite mysteriously. And then I work closely with Nicoletta as a fellow academic in humanities, and also Nicoletta has translated my poetry into Italian. So we have been noting some interesting things that we thought would be quite interesting to share in this context. I'll turn it to Nicoletta.
Exactly. Yeah. And so this is when we first reached out to, well, you Kimberley, you first reached out to Christos, and this is sort of how it all came about. We wanted to give maybe just a couple of disclaimers, as obviously we come from a different discipline, and so we're using a different methodology. And so, for example, I certainly, when I'll speak about my experiences of things that I have noted or noticed in the classroom, I do not have any kind of quantitative or reliable data at the moment, but I'm relying on sort of what I would define kind of arts and humanities methodologies, and especially on what has been done around creative practice. And then the other thing that we wanted to mention, and that this is very early on in the project, in our thinking about this project. So certainly at the end, we'll very warmly welcome any kind of thoughts or suggestions or ideas on how to bring it forward. So today for us, it's really about kind of getting the right questions and to enable us to continue thinking about this and seeing where it could lead. So I'll leave the floor to you, Kimberley.
Great. I'm just going to attempt to share my screen. Oh, there's a nice chime as if on cue. So can everybody see that? Okay.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay. So I suppose the first question is, I wanted to talk a bit about why I'm here. And I'm here because I found myself in the dark wood, or La Selva Oscura, as Dante Alighieri talks about in Canto 1 of his Inferno. And in Dante's Divine Comedy, which follows, for those of you I'm pretty sure most people will know, it follows an imaginary experience of the afterlife from the point of view of a poet called Dante, and he goes on through thrills and spills, and he's ultimately grappling with history, politics, ethics, the body. It's a very much an embodied poem, all the way to heaven, where he has to fly away into the sky, into the Empyrean. And so for me, I begin with this. This is a version of my translation of the opening of Dante's famous I found myself in the dark, at the midpoint in the journey of our life. I found myself in the dark wood. The straight road was lost. There's a million ways that that's been translated. But for me, I translated it. I found myself in the dark wood. I came to my senses, or they came to me in the form of pain. In other words, I could not, cannot, sometimes walk. And if I tried or try, my feet clutched or clutch the earth. My legs dragged or drag me down. My back pulled me, pulls me back, backwards, into the ground, into time. And so in my translation, as you can see, this is not in terza rima. It doesn't follow Dante's format of interlocking rhyme. And it's much more expansive in this part. And I explode what he's saying to take in not only my own personal experience, which echoes off of a lot of the imagery that he himself uses, but also a lot of the references that he's making, which are dug up by the long-standing commentary tradition of Dante's text, which has gone on for the past 700 years. So for me, the process of translation is kind of like snooping in other people's ideas and other people's sort of drawers and in their minds, not just the person who's written it, in this case Dante, but in the case of all the readers and anybody who's commented on the poem, and indeed all the other translators. So he's been translated clearly plenty. So why do this? Why translate a poem? Well, because as a poet, you tend to play with words quite a bit. And so of course I'm going to show you the Sylvian Fisher, which was named for Franciscus Sylvius, as I'm sure you know, and which is a translation itself of de la Beau, or of the wood. So it's a translation into Latin. And so there's always, in my view, something to be said for the relationship as a poet of what is weird about language, what is strange about language, and how poetry and literature, methodologically speaking, can allow us to see things slightly differently. So as Nicoletta said, I'm not coming at this empirically, but I am coming at this experimentally. So there are always experiments in words running in the life of a poet. I'm always testing words. I'm always seeing how words fit together, what happens when you pour them into a container and shake them up, when you put fire underneath them, all these sorts of things. And of course, it's not always going to be the same, because we know that the context in which these words are used greatly matters. And so I became really interested in translation because of my own experience and because of the physical experience that I was having with young onset Parkinson's. And in part because I am not a scientist, but I do like science, and I do like being at a university where I can access peer review for free and quite easily, and where I can have conversations with people about what I think about it. So I began reading, obviously, as many people do, not just what's on Google when you get diagnosed with something, but what's in the peer review. And of course, being a poet, I was very interested in all the research on language and all the research on how language is affected by Parkinson's, but also how language use can be a body of evidence for Parkinson's, and may indeed be a marker for Parkinson's, or certain phenotypes of Parkinson's. I know it's uncertain at this stage. And that is one of the scariest things for me about having Parkinson's, is the idea that were I to have deep brain stimulation, I may not be able to speak one day, because these things are certainly interlinked. And it's not necessarily the relationship of the illness. Sometimes it's the use of the medication, as we know. But I also noticed as a writer over time, and some of you may already be familiar with this, the notion of paradoxical kinesia, the notion that you can move even if you can't move, so that there's something in the brain that allows, as this article says, disabled PD patients remain able to produce normal motor responses in the context of urgent or externally driven situations, or even when exposed to appetitive cues such as music. And so this is where I began to realize that, of course, creativity, which has an emotional effect, but actually is a physical activity that I do, affects my symptoms of Parkinson's. But the thing that I noticed the most since I've been diagnosed since 2021 at age 41 is the way in which translation and crossing languages has had a greater effect on my experience of symptoms. So there's something about creativity, and there's something to me about crossing languages that is, to me, I cannot fully understand all the relationships and structures of the brain, but I would suggest there is something here that could be of interest to someone, and that I'm able to notice it simply because, as I said, as a poet, I'm always experimenting, and I'm experimenting in my practice, which is also my life, and is also the way in which my life manifests in my practice. And as a practitioner who is aware of the process of artistic practice as research, I am noting all the time how that process intersects with my quality of life, how that process intersects with my overall status, which has always been the case, but certainly since being ill is extremely so. So one of the things that I began to do when I was diagnosed with Parkinson's was seek to, I suppose, figure out what is most essential at the basis of who I am and what I'm about. And so this led me into an intense delving into my family's history and origins in Italy and Puglia. So this is just meant to show you the kind of way I've gone about it, which has involved gathering together documents or conversations, recollections of my great-grandmother, who was born in a very tiny village called Volterra Apula in Puglia, and that's it there on the screen. And so what I also found amidst the paradoxical kinesia experience is that there's something to be said for the rough terrain of a mountain village for inducing paradoxical kinesia for me. The worst place I can be is an accessible flat space. The best place I can be is on rough terrain, going up and down hills, being asked questions in dialect that I can vaguely understand, but that sounds more familiar originally than Italian did to me. And one of the questions that I was frequently asked was, "A chi appartieni?" Who do you belong to? Which is a different question than where are you from? And I think that became, for me, not unlike Dante's experience, that question of who do you belong to and who are you? In relation to language, in relation to how you use language to account for yourself, which as a writer, when you're telling your story, whoever you are, you're accounting for yourself. But writers, I think, are hyper aware of that, the power of grammar to affect and change people's perception. That's what we deal in. And so certainly cognitively and neuroscientifically, there's something going on in my brain, and I'm always wondering, how is that affecting how I'm using language? How is that affecting how I'm using words? Am I able to unwind some of that process? And if so, what are those mechanisms? And could they, in fact, be exploited more effectively? We know, of course, that one of the only things that's in any way neuroprotective in Parkinson's is exercise. But what about this sort of exercise? They say to challenge, to do, I did my PD warrior neurophysio. What should we only have people write expressively of themselves, whoever themselves is, in creative writing, or should we in fact challenge? And should some of that challenge be crossing languages, crossing borders, crossing time periods? So that's one of my kind of provocations. And so I began to develop a sense of my own way of translating, which I suppose is, again, to try to say this simply is very difficult, because the way that I think and always have thought has multiple possible meanings and deals a lot in parataxis. So in phrases that can be read multiple ways. So find sharing, climb down to upend, reread all signs, circle the unknown, flip along any phrase. So if I was to say how I do what I do, this is how I'm doing it. And I could pick out in more detail in a research context what exactly that means. So I'm happy to take further questions. I'm going to show some examples in a bit. Ooh, if I can move on to the next. So again, I don't just sit around reading neuroscientific articles. However, I am very interested, as I said, in how the process that I'm engaging in creatively might actually be working. And this isn't just because I work in a university and have Parkinson's, but because I think it has implications for what it means to be alive and why, in fact, creative arts are important, because why we still do them and why people are very nervous at the idea that somehow humans would be replaced in a creative context. So I think all of these things have implications. And one of the things that I landed on that I really quite liked is the idea of atypical salience. Because I was thinking, why am I bringing together all of these things and then saying that they make sense? Am I on the edge of madness? Am I on the edge of Parkinson's psychosis, right? So I'm also reading about the possibilities of that. And, here's just an example of some of my research folders for my Dante translation, golf, fascism, just random Lima. I try, and then just things that don't fit in any folder that just sit there, and the folders alphabetize them for me, and I can never find them again. But I think the idea is incorporating information that others overlook, and I think that this is where, in a clinical environment, certainly, I think, speaking as a person with Parkinson's and speaking as someone with a neurodegenerative illness that will not get better, I think it's important to note that that doesn't mean that I'm, increasingly overlooking things. In fact, I'm overlooking them, as in probably overly looking at them. I'm considering these things all the time. And so I think that sometimes those experiences that people with Parkinson's might have could benefit from a more atypically salient approach to accounting for what might actually be a creative way of managing in the world, which is not necessarily along the lines of the sort of outcomes that are obvious from what a clinical trial might be looking towards. So one of the things that I wanted to show a bit of is how my translations differ. And one of the ways that they differ is obviously in structure and form, but it's also in the way in which I use place. And so, as I said earlier, in working in this way that for the purposes of this talk, I'm describing as reliant on atypical salience, or relying upon a way that allows me to bring in everything rather than push things out. That's allowed me to take on various points of view. So I don't mention the good Apollo. I don't mention Parnassus, but I talk about poets trying to get help in describing how the world actually works. So I gesture towards the things that Dante's saying in a way that sounds quite personal, but bearing in mind that what Dante's saying would also have sounded quite personal to people who were aware of those references, but also has allowed me to speak about the time-bound sense that I have of degenerative illness, even though in this case I've just entered paradise. So, just so you can hear a bit of it, how that sounds. And the link there takes you to the Dante translation of Dante's original. Poets have tried, including me, to invoke for help that mountain or ring. Give me instead great lake waves to roll over rock from warm seas, polish stones, reveal old chains, breach my chest so I breathe in this exact place to all places linked, such power lent, I'll sign in shadow, such glory inscribed in my mind while I can. So you can see that obviously the rhythm and all of these things are quite compressed, but equally that it doesn't sound what we might expect a translation of Dante to sound in terms of the language I've used. And it is very linked to the specific places that I'm from and the specific historical context of those places, in this case, colonial, because in relying upon an approach of poetics that draws upon what I've called atypical salience or paradoxical kinesia, so seeking out a challenge rather than seeking out the path of least resistance. This has meant that I'm bringing everything into me. So I'm bringing in my day-to-day experience. I'm bringing in the actual verticality of every place that I am. So if I have to deal with origins, I have to deal with how those origins intersect with complex colonial genocide and other histories, and how in fact we are all linked. And so this has resulted in further context and further research that would not be the usual way, I would say, that people translate or update Dante, which then has led me to have lots of dialogue with people, with friends and family, with other academics, with poets about what I'm doing. And so, this is an example of a response to what I've done. And so this is a person who grew up in Elkhart, Indiana, which is where I'm from. And Elkhart is named for the heart, the city with a heart, the heart of the elk in between the two rivers. And this person says, this passage got me in my heart. I suppose I've never looked at Elkhart as anything but a functional place. I
couldn't actually see.
I grew up in, and frankly with disdain, and it's lovely to see it through a different lens. So I think what's interesting about this is that, we're talking about poetry, and I'm talking to someone who doesn't actually read poetry on a regular basis. So this is something that, has struck them and yet is familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, which is an area that for me as an artist, I think is relevant to neuroscience and is relevant to some of the questions we're going to ask today, and is relevant to working across languages, which is something that a formalist literary theorist, Viktor Skhlovsky, calls estrangement. The idea that the goal of art is to create the sensation of seeing, not merely recognizing things. The device of art is the estrangement of things and the complication of the form, which increases the duration and complexity of perception, as the process of perception is, in art, an end in itself and must be prolonged. Art is the means to live through the making of a thing. And he refers to this idea of art, and he means all artistic disciplines, is to make us feel things, to make a stone stony. And so I think that that's perhaps what we feel the most fear about as people with neurodegenerative illness, or indeed any illness, that we may not feel the stone is stony anymore, or maybe we feel the stone is a bit too stony, and that's part of that sensation that we have. And so I think the work of art is about organizing that feeling and about putting that feeling across in a way that others can take. But also, when you're working across languages, all things become estranged, because why is English like this when you see how another language is working, especially another language that has already been estranged in a literary context? And so when I say meanwhile where you are, what I mean is this question of there seems to be a tendency in a lot of contexts in creative writing anyway, and in a lot of therapeutic contexts in which I know that creative writing has been used, to really tether people to the eye or to the speaker of their own text. And I think that has been critiqued, but I also think we could go a step farther and bring people towards texts that are in fact from other languages and that have already been written, and that maybe that would allow for further creativity and further possibility in a positive sense, cognitively and otherwise, as I've experienced, and I know Nicoletta is going to talk about. And so when I came across Christos's work, because obviously I was looking into, well, this is like creativity plus multiple languages, this creativity plus, kind of dredging up bits of Italian and bits of dialect that were in my brain somewhere, but then also having to learn these things. And then the effect was even stronger. So when I came across his research, I was fascinated to learn about the possibilities there about the brain structure and function and the effects of multilingual experience, and also on the idea that this multilingual experience is a diverse context in and of itself, which is what the protocol is meant to address for future studies. So this is where I talk about myself a bit. And so I think I'm running out of time. I always have this. But I think one of the things that I wanted to end with is that the idea that, this is a quote from the earlier article, that external stimuli may lead to paradoxical kinesia by energizing some of these old alternative motor systems. So in this, they're talking about the inferior collicus and its relationship to the amygdala. And I think it's similar to this quote from Kings when Hezekiah is trying to get the sundial, get Isaiah to get the sundial to move backwards. So it's this idea of making things a bit harder to show that to make it really count. And I think that that's what, for me, creative translation is that it's energizing something very old, which is however it was that I learned language, however it was that I first experienced those words in my first language. And so I think that this connects to paradoxical kinesia, and it took me all the way through my atypical salient approach to go look at this door in Benevento, which has a bit of a story to it. It took me to look at and to see something else that I didn't expect to see, which is the amygdala scraping some of the oldest stone tools in human civilization. And so, of course, it's shaped as an almond, that's where it comes from, but it's also shaped as something quite important. And I think that there's something here in the way that all these things connect. And I think, I hope that we can have a conversation about taking some of this forward. So I will leave it there.
Thank you, Kimberly. Sorry, there will be a little bit of a buffer as I share my screen, but okay. So I think you should be able to see my slides now. So
yes, we are.
Great. Okay, good. So it should, yeah, perfect. Now it should be in slideshow. Actually, sorry. Okay, so it's always really hard to follow Kimberly, but I'll do my best. I guess my perspective is different in a sense that I'm coming to this topic. This is something that actually Kimberly sort of had been thinking about independently, and then sort of informally started talking about it, and why does no one see connections between literary translation and benefits for mental health, or obviously in Kimberly's case, kind of more like a neurological conditions. So what I'm going to do today, what I'm going to do today is to talk a little bit about myself, just so that you understand, where I'm coming from, how I came to literary translation, which is what we're going to focus on today, what I do with it, both in my teaching practice and elsewhere, what I've noted or noticed in myself and others, and some of, and my students. And finally, I'm going to end just with some considerations of what I personally would like to find out, and how perhaps the sciences can help me and Kimberly figure it out. So first off, I think it's important for me to tell you that I'm a scholar of early 20th century literature, and I'm a comparativist, so I work across European languages and literary traditions. So my background is in comparative literature. as it were, this is my day job. But I've over the last decade or so, over the last 10 years, I've developed more than an interest. Like I've actually developed a kind of almost like a parallel role or parallel profile as a literary translator. How I came to that. So I'm originally from Italy, and I speak or have studied 10 languages. But I also know, like, I think the knowledge of these languages gives me some sort of passive knowledge or more. So I've always found learning new languages extremely fascinating. Even though I come from a monolingual family, I was raised monolingual. I then went on and decided to, at every point in my academic trajectory, I decided to study languages and more languages. Why I mentioned this is because right up to a certain point in my personal and academic life, translation was actually something that I thought I needed to avoid. So translation work is used quite frequently, certainly in the Italian schooling system, as a part of assessment, right? So how do you say this word in this other language, and so on, or actually as a proper literary translation work. So I remember, being given passages of, ancient Greek text or Latin text or English text to translate. But even then, when we did that, the fact that we were translating literature wasn't so much the point. The point was, am I understanding the text, right? The point that the teachers wanted to check was precisely, am I translating things as if they were equivalences, right? So am I translating A as B? Rather than, there was no interest in actually literary translation as creative practice. It was just a part of language learning and assessment. But then when I moved first to Ireland and then to the UK, I realized that actually there were I think that was the moment when I first realized of the politics of translation. Quite simply put, like stepping into a bookshop in this country and realizing that a lot of the translated authors that I was used to seeing in bookshops in Europe weren't there, made me realize actually, but who decides what to translate and from what languages and so on. And this is how in my life in the UK, I started becoming more interested in these questions and sort of developing it as a side interest, while kind of retaining my early 20th century modernist profile. And this is what and this is what kind of led me to begin translating and trying to get translations published. So the very, 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 very first thing I did was just it was a very small thing for that book. It was a team translation, but it really started me to think about ideas which are relevant to today's talk, which is I translated the parts of this novel when I was a PhD student, and I was translating from a third language into what was then and is now my second language, which is English. And I was writing my PhD, and I was a relatively happy PhD student, but even so, I was working on my PhD during the day and working on translations in the evening. And I remember feeling a real sense of accomplishment and reward every time I could get a paragraph right, or I could figure out what was said in the original. So this, I guess, led me to do more work in picking up more literary translation projects. Sometimes commissioned, sometimes I chose my own, and very recently I've been working to get Kimberley's work translated into Italian. So this is not just to boast of my accomplishments, but rather to say that what I felt that actually I could, instead of what I was doing when I was a student and when I was just learning languages and translation was used as a part of an assessment, that actually literary translation was for me a great way to contribute to creative practice, for me to be creative, alongside actually being an academic, was something that I thought, could in some ways enable me to be creative, but in kind of in a more controlled way. And I'll speak to that in a moment. So in the last decade as well, we've seen, certainly in the UK and in the US, a shift in scholarship, in recognizing that actually literary translation is a creative practice. So literary translation has been considered always the kind of a derivative art. Then there's the original with the capital O, and then there is a translation. But in the last decade or so, with investments in also like diversifying the literary translation industry and the kind of what we can offer as in bookshops, whether they're online or actual physical spaces, literary translation has made it into departments, into kind of centers as an actual practice, as part of the creative writing or creative practice offering. And I just have a very, very quick quotation on the slide by Professor Cecilia Rossi, who is the director of the British Centre for Literary Translation at UEA, where she says we need to shift attention from the translator as reader to the translator as writer. And I think this is a crucial point to make, because translators are necessarily readers and they're necessarily interpreters of the text, but they're also writers, and they need to routinely come up with creative solutions to solve translation problems, like also the ones that Kimberley was referring to just earlier. So literary translation is, as I said, kind of thrives on creativity. So it seems to me that it's a perfect element, or kind of for this kind of paradigm of thinking about mental health or mental well-being and literary translation as a craft and creativity. So on this slide, I've selected the very beginning of an introduction to this translation diary. So Daniel Hun is a British translator of mostly Spanish and French, and I think he also translates from Portuguese fiction. And for the what I think is one of the very first times in literary translation history, he published a translation log online, which then became a translation diary, which you can see the cover of on the screen, basically recording and making visible every sort of kind of thought process he had for some of the for the translation he was commissioned to do for this publisher. So the fact that this is also published as a book is particularly important, because it aims to make visible the actual work of literary translators. So I'll just read this bit, because I think it's great instead of exemplifying what we mean by literary translation. I'm a literary translator. Okay, but what does that actually entail? Well, to put it most simply, my job is to read a book in language A and write it again in language B. I read with all the sensitivity, insight, and analytical acumen I can bring to a text. And then I create a new thing, one that's identical to the original book, except for all the words. A new thing to allow a book I've loved to meet new readers. One might imagine translation to be an intimidating thing, a sort of miracle of baffling complexity. But let's not start there, because on the most basic level, translation is those two things, each of them simple enough, after all. Translation is reading and translation is writing. In a sense, there's really no more to it than that. Translators read a text, then write another text. Read something in Diamela Eltid's Spanish, and then write something in my English. Yes, doesn't that sound simple enough? And of course, part of the book is precisely to answer that question, that it isn't quite that simple, because transferring a book from one language into another without having that language to rely on is exactly the problem. And this is why I think it's important to think of literary translation as an art, but especially as a craft, as something that you keep working at and that you keep chiseling and making and trying and trying to make right. It's quite far for me from precisely those kind of assessment I had as a in school, where I would probably be marked wrong if I didn't translate the ancient Greek work oikos as environment, but as something else, right? So it's so this is what what I think is kind of is important to consider when we're thinking about mine and Kimberley's work, or in fact any of the kind of literary translators. Daniel Hahn, just to quote another short bit from this introduction, also calls it an translation as an aspirational craft, in the sense that what it intends is somehow predetermined. So the process is one of reaching towards that thing, trying to come close to it, as close as different languages and individual skill and circumstance allow. I don't believe one can make a perfect translation, obviously, but I do know what, in the abstract, would characterize a perfect translation of a novel if one could. I know what such a thing would be. So I like the idea of thinking about translation as an aspirational craft, because that aspiration, I think, is what keeps literary translators going, as it were. The idea of working at something which actually already by default or from the beginning, will lack the perfection of the original, and also that it will age. It will necessarily age. We know that translations often need to be redone, need to be republished and edited again and again, rather than instead of the original, which normally remains as it is and stands the face of time. So it seems to me really relevant to be thinking about health and mental health with a task that actually from the beginning, it seems to set you up for failure. And this is something that Deborah Smith, the translator of Han Kang's The Vegetarian, which perhaps if you've read or come across, says, all I can do is to fail and fail again and fail better when I translate. So this is the background that led me to introduce a new module in the English degree. So as I said, I'm an English literature scholar. I work in an English department. And for the last 5 years, I've been teaching literary translation to English literature students. So my thought was, again, like thinking experimentally, what would happen if we included a literary translation module to an English literature degree? So normally, translation modules are only offered in modern languages departments as part of, say, German, French, Spanish degrees. Normally, this is where they sit. This is where they live. But what would happen if we just taught students with an interest in literature, in writing, in creativity, literary translation? So some of my, suddenly there were challenges at the beginning, and suddenly some of my colleagues thought that there was an absolutely, completely, hilarious idea, but actually it turned out to be quite rewarding, and the results were quite promising. So I'm happy to talk more about this, in detail later, but I'll just give you some pointers. So this is a third-year advanced option module, and so students choose it. And I think this is important in a sense because the kind of students who take this module have chosen that module because they were interested in it. The thing it does is certainly it contributes to internationalizing the English degree, both in the curriculum and what it offers, and in the student profile, the student population. So because students choose this module, most of the students who take it are bilingual or multilingual, and often come from often rather second generation backgrounds. So they speak heritage languages at home. But this is not always, this is the majority of students, or maybe about half or a bit more more than a half. And the rest is students who have taken A-levels in French or Spanish or German or whatever, and they're generally interested in getting that language going, making something, in actually doing something with that language. The important thing is that while in all the other modules in English degrees, actually personal backgrounds are not really important, in this module they are. And so I think I'm doing something of something good for the students, certainly, in terms of making international students and making British students who come from, who may have, a Swedish grandfather or, an Indian mother or whatever. Like they always report saying, they always say that they feel a lot more seen in this module, because suddenly the fact that they speak an additional language at home, or that they have a kind of a cookie interest, like I do, in learning all the languages of the world, is suddenly an asset, which is something that is also in the professional world, but not necessarily in the context of an English only degree. So this is one of the things that that I think it's important to note. The students work on the translation of their choice throughout the semester and take it to class, and then we discuss it. And this I think has led to several considerations on my side, at least, which is that the students taking this module tend to be less anxious, and in fact, they seem to be, even those with kind of depression and anxiety diagnosis seem to be coping better with the type of assessment, but also with the sort of conversations that we have, than if there was a purely theoretical module, because this is practice-based and it's based on creative practice, as I said. Students have reported in feedback, in module evaluation, and also informally to me and to other colleagues. Well, I was told this afterwards, that they feel more creative and that they find literary translation is liberating for them. So I think this for me is what made me think about the issues that I want to discuss today, that I want us to discuss today. I think literary translation has the benefit that it doesn't get you to start from the blank page. We're not sitting in the wilderness with a blank notebook wanted to write an epic poem, right? We are starting from someone else's words. And I do think it means that to some extent, we can use creativity in a more controlled way. We're starting from something, and we may well turn it into something else, and something that is profoundly ours, but it will be completely different. It's starting from somewhere. Then there's the question of AI, which obviously we discuss constantly in the module, and the students have reported to me precisely that the same feeling that I felt sort of the first time, sort of when I doing the first literary translation project, that they feel they're producing something, and that is their own, and that there's their own product of creativity, and they feel the reward. And so when they were asked to actually put in their a bit of the text they decided to translate into ChatGPT, they felt extreme anxiety and extreme sadness, because they felt the literary translation was no longer an art and a craft, but rather it was something just mechanical, which they felt could not be. So I will come to my conclusion, which is really more like open questions. But at this point, I think what I'd like to find out, or what I'd like to study, or would like to get help with, is to ponder whether literary translation can effectively boost creativity. So can it actually help other creative tasks? Or is creativity to be found more easily in individuals with knowledge of more than one language? And finally, can the work of literary translation help creativity freezes? And can literary translation, seen as a craft, also help individuals with anxiety and or experiencing mental health issues or crisis? So I think I'll stop here, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback and conversation.
Thank you very much, Kimberly and Nicoletta. That was exciting as always. This is not the way I think about Parkinson's or bilingualism or translation, so that gives me loads of food for thought, I suppose. So, do we have any questions for our speakers? So I think my colleague Ludovica Serra-Ricci here has a question.
Hi, thank you both, Kimberley and Nicoletta. Yeah, so Chris and I were just having a chat because we watched this together in his office today. And I was just wondering, so do you think there is something special about the translation process? And Kimberley was talking about, going across two languages. Or is it more, I mean, it's a creative thing, obviously. And Nicoletta, you were talking about your students' sort of sense of, I guess, self-efficacy and enjoyment and pride in what they achieved creatively. But do you think it could be any creative process? So if they had, I don't know, done life drawing or I don't know, like a vase, do you think, or is it the going between things that really is the crux of the matter here? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you have an answer, but I don't know if it's something that you think it's about the translation process per se.
I can answer first because I think for me, because I write creatively outside of this project, this is my current project, I can say it feels extremely different to me than, I guess, what Nicoletta says, the blank page, or from other creative things that I do in day-to-day life, and certainly from the things that as a person with Parkinson's that we're encouraged to do. And I think what it does is, and it might have come across in my talk, is it requires you to bring things towards you. It requires you to bring towards you another world, and that world in itself is very complex because, as we know, language is not a singular thing. It's changing all the time with every interaction we have. We can't pin it down. So the fact that it's always moving keeps me moving, and I think that that's the thing that's different about translation, that many people live in translation, right? I mean, we're not all in our first language in this call, but I think when it's creative, when it's given the space, it actually unlocks something quite powerful, that is intersubjective, that involves other people and other times and places.
Yeah, I absolutely, I would agree. I think this is something that Christos had asked us previously, in a sense, like, wouldn't any task that you like doing, right? Like, it could be knitting, or it could be, wouldn't that be kind of sufficient, like, that you like doing it and that's it? But I think I'm a moderately creative person in sense of like other hobbies or tasks or things, and I do think that literary translation seems to me to be quite intrinsically different. In a way, we could think of it as solving problems, but it's not quite like solving a puzzle or solving a crossword, in the sense that then there's a definite answer and that is the end. Like, once you've finished your crossword, that's it. This is ongoing, and there might be like it never entirely leaves you. And I think it allows you to use the brain and use languages together in a way that other tasks don't quite do it. I mean, I see it with students, like they translate from any language into English, and in a group, I tend to not put the same languages together. And so it's great to see how someone with French might help someone with, I don't know, like Vietnamese, for example, right? Like there's something about just, comparing even language systems, I think, that really stimulates creativity, at least. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, Kimberly, you wanted to follow up on this?
Yeah, I mean, I have the citation somewhere, but one of the articles that I've read is about moving, the difficulty some people with Parkinson's have, and it's been shown to have, using verbs. And when they retrofit it to people selecting, turning verbs into nouns, that they found that that's harder for people with Parkinson's when it when it involves a huge number of choices because of that movement. But I think what happens when you don't make it about right answers and choices is that you're operating in a different place. And so that's where interpreting and straight up translation differ from what we're talking about, and differ from perhaps what, as I referred to, there's another article that is talking about, you know, abstract concepts and how we learn them, and how that activates certain motor aspects and certain bodily parts. And to me as a poet, that makes perfect sense. That's why poetry makes us feel things, because it's operating on and putting those words together, perhaps in those ways that we first recall them. And I think translation is doing something quite similar.
Yeah, I'm thinking of 100 parallels between what you describe in a language processing in general, blah, 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 but I don't want to take up the time. Vishnu?
Hi, Kimberly and Nicoletta. I find your talk quite fascinating. And Kimberly, I'm still formulating the question, so apologies if I'm really not making any sense, but I just found your talk so fascinating and really moving as well at the same time. So I'm just reading this book and I just cannot stop thinking about what you just said. And I just want to read a little bit from what they are just saying, and then that kind of relates to my question, because I'm trained as a speech and language therapist. So I'm really deep into the disability studies and the intersection with multilingualism on that. So these folks are talking about what arts and health, how we can intersect, and what it can bring to our understanding of disability. And they are talking about the scholarship that asserts approaches to primarily from a mental health perspective based on psychiatry need to be reworked. That this is a process involving multiple pathways. There is a drive, of course, to unpick and rethink language of diagnosis, to complicate what it is meant by therapy, and the restorative models provided by art and health models, and to problematize the idea of recovery narratives and their presumed status as the most beneficial outcomes of mental health treatment. Work the way you are talking, complicating the, Parkinson's itself is very revisionist and very radical. So it frames to critique within subjects and terms. It doesn't have to be creative within the critical imagination that drives disability studies, thinking around mental health. The commitment to bending time, bodies, delusions that makes them complex, theorize, and fuse states. So what I'm trying to get at is that you're really complicating the simplistic models of Parkinson's or for disability from a very neuroscience or cognitive models to complicating it with language, neuroscience, temporality, and all of that, right? So what I'm trying to ask is that have you thought about how your story and your lived experience of these multiple intersections proliferate, creating stories around multiple ways, how we can think about that particular disability and particular disability embodiment, and how that might lead to better care practice, which is kind of relating to what Nicoletta is also talking about in terms of translation. So have you thought from a disability perspective as well?
Absolutely. I mean, that's what my lectures this semester are about for my students. It's about the tyranny of the text and the tyranny of the eye and the tyranny of the ear in poetry. And whether, in fact, language, the tactility of language is experienced and breathed and as touched and as felt differentially depending on these sorts of things. So, I mean, definitely I'm thinking along the lines of, how an ableist paradigm causes us not to see certain things. So when I was thinking about atypical salience, it's not that I have special powers because I have Parkinson's. It's in fact that as a result of the context in which I'm in and the ways in which my lived experience has played out, I can see these gaps in what may actually be happening in lots of different ways for lots of different people, but we're not actually seeing or feeling or hearing or touching because we're busy trying to look at other things. And I think we could easily miss some quite good disease targets for various things, but also some ways to make things a bit more fun and connected as well along the way. So absolutely, it's part of my thinking. It's a quick answer. I would love to talk more. Please be in touch.
Here we have one last question by Ken.
Hi, yeah. It was great to be invited to this. It's a really interesting combination. My background's in mental health and in neuroscience, so it sort of ticked both boxes really. I just quick one to Nicoletta. It's a lot easier to operationalize mental health assessment than it is creativity. I think there's a general assumption that creativity is good for you, and if you self-report that you're doing more of it, then that's a good thing. I mean, it was really challenged that. So I wonder how, if you're going to research this, how are you going to deal with that? And then to Kimberley, in addition to the uneven ground, I was reading about some people with Parkinson's disease tackling a staircase being easier than sort of voluntary, and it's almost one of the theories is that this taps into like an automated subroutine. So I think really you're like cutting edge action research, given that also the stuff about the effect of Parkinson's disease on use of language, and particularly verbs, is very new, relatively new, and that you actually, as you say, doing like linguistic physio by doing your translation is a kind of interesting idea, really, and it'll certainly be an interesting way of. Are you taking it further? That is you doing this anecdotally, or are you trying to communicate with other people who might be able to tap into this?
Yeah, I think I mean, regarding the mental health and my students, I mean, essentially, I can see how it might be challenging to measure or to understand exactly. I mean, I think anecdotally, I mean, very anecdotally, like I can see students' performance on various modules differ, especially there is we offer a number of creative writing modules in my department. So those are straightforward creative writing. They could about prose or poetry. And often there's an overlap of students who take the literary translation module, my module, and those modules. But they like the performance seems to be different, and also how they feel in the dealing with the peer review in the seminar is different. So with the creative writing work, obviously they'll have to come with their own stories, right? With the stories that I've written, perhaps not necessarily autobiographically, but there might be something that they're starting from. And obviously that is a lot more anxiety inducing than translating a text that might well be close to you, for whatever reason, but it's still separate from you. But yes, I think, I mean, I'm happy there seems to be something, right? But how exactly to do it will be the question. Yeah. And Kimberley, I think you had a good answer.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, I want to take it forward, but I definitely need people who want to take it forward with me, because I can only do so much. I'm kind of doing this as I'm going along, but certainly the stairs is a thing. But I don't know if that went into the chat. I am taking this method of working did that go into the chat? Yeah, and there's a second one that talks about it that I can't get to go into the chat, but I'm taking this method to a different context, into Seacroft and Leeds, to work on this kind of place-based riffing sort of way of translating in a place that's specifically been targeted by far-right flaggers. And so, the aim is to bring everyone together and to work across languages, and to work not necessarily with the written text, but to work through audio, to work through whatever means that we can come together with an existing text, as Nicoletta is saying. I mean, I think that the fact that literary texts already are jam-packed with a lot of power, which is the power of, as Viktor Skhlovsky says, to make the stone stony again. These aren't just paragraphs. These are texts with a lot going on in them, and a lot of text within them. So I think that that's where the power of it is, that communication across time and space. And I think that that's where what Nicoletta is doing is, again, if people want to pick up on these things, it would be really, I think, not least for the general state of things, a positive thing to work on for a while.
Well, thank you. I still find this fascinating. I'm still trying to get my head around how we can combine everything. And we've had these conversations, Kimberley and Nicoletta, of how we could empirically test these predictions, how everything could come together. We are over time already, unless there are no other last quick questions. Ken, is that a legacy hand? Yeah, okay.
Please do be in contact with us,
Well,
anyone.
yes, we'll get in contact. Yeah. Thank you very much for delivering this seminar. Certainly different to what we normally have in this series. And yeah, happy to see you again soon. Bye-bye.